I'm joined by Jack McEncroe. He was a U.S. Marine fighter and attack pilot, Vietnam War combat veteran, flying 352 combat missions. He joins me here. I'm Brian Fenley, and over the course of this conversation, we are going to hear firsthand what he went through in Vietnam, the implications of it, and how it's influenced the way that he and the rest of his command buddies have been perceived over the years. A lot to get into, but some good storytelling. And to be able to have you on, Jack, is really an honor. Thanks so much for allowing me this opportunity to tell your story with everything that comes with it, surreal, gripping anecdotes that surely have shaped your life from then and to this day.
Thank you, Brian. Nice to be with you.
I can only imagine that there are many vets that have a hard time talking about what they've gone through. I know my grandfather, who served in World War II, didn't like to talk about a lot of things, but there are some who have, and you certainly, despite what you've gone through, and we'll get into that, have had a willingness to talk about it. How has talking about what you've gone through affected you since those moments that you went through?
I think it's always good to discuss this. I tend to remember the funny things more than the sad things. I tend to dwell on the funny things rather than the sad things. And we have an organization called the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. We have an annual reunion. And it was originally formed by all the guys that flew over Hanoi and Haiphong during the Vietnam War, and that was the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aerial warfare. When I first went there, I started talking to friends, and it was because of that that really brought that out. Before that, I never really talked about it much, and I don't talk about it now unless somebody asks me or unless I'm at one of those reunions.
This is one of those opportunities to talk about it. And you mentioned how heavily defended that part of the country was. How fearful were you knowing that when you began those missions in the risks that you and your your fellow counterparts were going through?
Well, I often say in speeches, the most often heard prayer by those going into combat for the first time is, please God, don't let my buddies down. Let me let my buddies down. Uh, once you're exposed to it, you're exposed to it. You say, wow, I can do that. From then on, are there minutes of or seconds of terror? Yes. Do you get through them? Yes. You have a job to do. You do your job. If it's close air support, you're dropping ordnance, bombs, rockets, 20 millimeter, napalm. You're dropping it very close to friendly troops. You can't be worried about anything but where I'm going to put that ordnance and how I'm going to help those guys on the ground.
What does it take, and what did it take for you to be so locked in, so focused on those coordinates, knowing everything that was at stake and everything that was on the line?
I guess it's the power of youth or the idiocy of youth. I don't know. Uh, you've just got a job to do, and your worst nightmare would ever be hurting a friendly troop, be it Marines, Army, no matter who. Uh, and so I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. That's good.
I know that you would know the answer to this next question, which I think that prior answer actually answered my question, even though you don't think it did. But here's the next question, and I know you're going to have an answer to this one. Is what was the scene like when your feet hit Vietnam for the first time, when you were boots on the ground for the first time, and what played out in front of you in those first days and weeks that you were there?
Well, our squadron was based at El Toro, California, which is no longer a Marine base. And we flew our own airplanes over to Vietnam, air-to-air refueling, which there's a number of funny stories go with that. I had never refueled in the air until the day before the transpac. And everything was rush, 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 rush. We had to get ready. We had to go. We had a date we were leaving. And our skipper had the oldest airplanes in the Marine Corps inventory. He had three, four combat veterans. The rest of us were all brand new. We even part of our leadership had never been in combat. So he was tasked with a Herculean task and he got us up to speed. But my air-to-air refueling fell through the cracks. So I walked in the day before and I said, I've never air-to-air refueled. And they went, oh, hell. So they launched an A4. I went up and I plugged into that. And in the Marine Corps and the Navy, we have to plug into a basket, which is probably about like this in a circle. So the probe actually to take the fuel is behind our heads. So you zero in on a point of the airplane and you fly formation on that. And you don't know that that has gotten in and nobody can guide you to it. Your backseater can see it, but he can't guide you to it because you'll be all over the place. So you just fly in on a portion of the airplane, plug into it, and then when you get your fuel, like we took on fuel until we stalled out and just fell out because we got too heavy because the airplanes that were refueling us could only go 220 knots, and that is in a slight dive. So that's one of the funny stories. The other funny story is the first time I ever night refueled was coming out of Hanoi, and we were getting ready to go up to Hanoi, and I just asked one of the other guys, I said, how the hell do you do this? And he told me there'll be a white light, just same as daytime, fly in on that white light. It worked out.
How?
Uh,
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
so as far as leaving El Toro and flying all the way across the Pacific, none of us had ever done this before. We did stop in Hawaii, Wake, Guam, and the Philippines, and then on into Hanoi. So your original question is, how was it when you first landed or your boots first hit the ground? Well, my wheels first hit the ground, and I taxied in and I opened the canopy and I was hit with that heat and humidity. And I went, oh God, 13 months of this. And the weather never got any better. Uh, but after I got over the initial shock, my attitude sure did.
During those times when you were serving in Vietnam, 67 to 68, if I'm not mistaken, but
Right.
the Vietnam conflict in a broader way was dominating the dinner table conversations of Americans across all places during the mid 60s. You had heard some of the things that perhaps were released or what was known, and then there were the things that you experienced when you got there. How different, and let me say it like this, Jack. Your initial expectations of what you were going to expect when you got there, boots on the ground, how different was that? Or was it different than what you thought after what you had heard, being that the Vietnam War was such a topic of conversation across the US during that time?
I really had no idea what to expect. Uh, and so when I got there, up until the time, I flew the first mission, which we did not get shot at. The second time we were shot at, and I used a 90-degree dive, diving down on guns, and I could see the tracers going by out of the corners of my eye, but I was too focused on where I was going And it was after that mission that my Rio, my backseater, Steve Lear, as soon as we pulled off target, we said, well, check that box. We've done it. And from then on, I don't know how much I really ever thought of it. It was just, here's the target, do your job.
In a way, do you feel like you had to desensitize yourself to what was going on just because it could be so easy to get overwhelmed by the gravity of what you were doing?
I think, when we got there, the majority of the new guys, we were all 23, 24. Uh, we were excited. We were really looking forward to this challenge. We've been training for 6 months. So I'm not sure what I anticipated, but there's such a closeness of guys doing the same thing uh, in peril. And, it just was like pretty soon, it was just like going to work. You flew your time, you came home. I don't have any really alarming things that came to mind. I just did what I was trained to do.
The training which you hit on, I do want to talk about that for a moment. What was the training like, and how did it prepare you or work to prepare you for what eventually you would expect?
I felt like we were prepared very well, as much as a wet behind the ears kid can be prepared in 6 months. Uh, our commanding officer had fought with the French against the Vietnamese. He got out of the Marine Corps. He'd fought in Korea. He knew what to expect and he prepared us for it. He brought in speakers that would speak with us uh, at all pilots meetings or all aircrew meetings. Uh, so I don't, I'm probably not the best person to ask that. Even though I was there, I just did my job.
Job. Doing your job in the form of flying 352 combat missions, how hard is it because of so many to individually remember them? I can't even imagine, Jack, just because of how many you went through and how you were with your buddies and you had objectives and things to accomplish that in what way does it feel to you like a blur, all of those missions? And then what has to happen for it to stand out, if any of them do, per se?
Um, your description, it's a blur, is a very good one. Uh, but if something particularly noteworthy, we had a lot of intense fire. We dropped right close to troops and saved them. Um, we were unable to get to a target because of weather. Uh, Terrible weather, still getting to the target. Things like that stick out. Uh, but honestly, they're mostly a blur. And if something funny happened, like my backseater, Steve Lear, was a stand-up comic. So I mean, he was so damn funny. He was from Louisiana. He'd been an Air Force brat. He went to LSU. I grew up in Southern California. I was kind of a surfer kid, and and something came out. We'll talk about, I'm sure, uh, later. But I would just say something, and he would come up and say, "What'd you say?" And he said, "Oh, I was reading the paper," or "I was listening to rock and roll," or just something, break the tension, laugh. That's the kind of stuff that is indelibly imprinted in my mind. Not all the airplanes we lost, the guys we lost, or any of that. That certainly was front and center in my mind, but you just had to shut it out and go do your job.
I want to talk more about that relationship you have with, at the time, your backseater. What do you feel like, Jack, was the most heroic thing that you did out there?
Um, I, I don't think we're heroes. Uh, I don't think there was anything that, made me a hero. I can tell you about some heroes, but I don't consider myself a hero at all.
What does it take to be a hero in your mind?
Um, well, I'll give you a hero story, and I like talking about other guys. Uh, my best friend for many years was a fellow by the name of Bob Pardo, and he is known for an incredible story entitled Pardo's Push. They were on a bombing mission up to the Taiwan steel mill northeast of Hanoi. And as they rolled in, somebody in a flight ahead of him, a fellow by the name of Earl Amon, had been hit and hit hard. And he was hit on the way to the target, and then he was hit pulling off. Bob was also hit going in, and Earl pulled off and started climbing, trying to get altitude underneath him because when the F4 quits, the engines quit, you're flying a bank safe. The aerodynamics are terrible and you're going straight down. So Bob came off the target, heard of Earl's plight. He came up behind him and he was trying to think of a solution. So he told Earl to put his hook down, an arresting hook. Everybody's probably seen it in movies. That's what stops you when you go aboard a carrier. So he told him to put his hook down, and Bob tried to come up underneath him and push that hook. That airplane weighed somewhere around 34,000 pounds. So Earl had to go into a dive to accommodate Bob being able to push him. There's a little part of the F4, it's shaped like a football. It's right in front of our face. And we're told that's the only bulletproof part on the F4. So Bob figured, well, if that's the strongest point, then that's where I'm going to put the hook. Well, it didn't work out like that because the jet wash was pushing him around. And Earl finally climbed to 35,000 feet, uh, and he was leaking fuel like mad. And he told Bob this is really critical. So Bob said, there's a little compartment behind the vertical stabilizer, which is just over the top of the engines. If I can get my nose into there, well, he couldn't. Jet wash, too bad. So he went back down again and started pushing. Now, the weight of the airplane is 34,000 pounds. If that little football-sized window doesn't hold, he, Bob Pardo, and his backseater, Steve Wayne, are going to be crushed instantly. And they don't know what's going to happen. So he tells Earl to shut his engines down because Earl was so low on fuel. He shut his engines down, went into a slight dive. Bob came up underneath him and he was able to push him 88 miles. When they got over northern Laos, which is still Indian country, but much safer than being around Hanoi and Haiphong, uh, Bob said, that's about all I can do. He'd pushed him from 35,000 down to 6,000. So he told Earl and his backseater to eject. They did. He called two good shoots to Rescap, which is a Jolly Green, who you mentioned heroes. They're the real heroes of that war for pulling us out of tight places. So he identified he had two shoots, told them where they were, and a Jolly Green came in to get them. Right after they ejected and they reported it, Bob and Steve had to eject because they'd used all their fuel pushing their pals to safety.
Wow.
That's the hero.
Yeah. Those are the things that you remember so vividly to this day. And I feel honored that you would share that story with me. And now I can really understand. I can't understand, but I can begin to see why what you said early on at the very beginning of this conversation is that the worst thing you want to see happen is something happen to one of your buddies.
Right.
And the way in which you were affected by that story plays right into how important it was, the man next to you. It must have felt the closeness that you got with these guys, the family like environment. How did that play itself out when you were on base and you were really further getting to know these guys and how you would spend your time together?
Well, we all had something in common. And you know, the Marines and the Army soldiers on the ground, they weren't able to go to an O Club. We were. So a lot of camaraderie was built in the O Club. Um, you know, having a few drinks, laughing, loosening up. Uh, and you said something about how important those men next to you, your wingmen, were, and how important the guys on the ground were that you were trying to save. Uh, but also, there's one more factor, uh, and those are the Marines entrusted to you. They work for you. You're responsible for them. And I felt just as close to them as I did any of my fellow pilots. And if it hadn't been for them, I wouldn't have gotten to fly an airplane because they're the guys that work out there on that flight line in 110-degree heat and 100% humidity, 12 hours, 12-hour shifts, and they're loading the airplane. They're making sure it's safe to fly. Uh, you know, pilots are just an instrument to deliver a weapon. Uh, the kids on the ground, the Marines on the ground to prepare these airplanes, they're heroes.
Well said. What was a briefing like before going into a mission?
Uh, our photos were usually outdated. Uh, the Air Force would have, very, very detailed briefings because they flew these mass strikes uh, with maybe 7 or 8 flights of 4 going in on a target. We didn't do that in the Marine Corps because we weren't tasked with that. Number one, most important were our Marines and soldiers on the ground that we protected. Secondarily, every fighter pilot would love to have an air-to-air kill. I mean, that's what we live for. Uh, so going to Hanoi and Haiphong, we escorted A6s up there and then stood off maybe 20 miles south of Hanoi, stood off at 14,000 feet and watched those guys come in at night at, sometimes 500 feet and below, dropping their ordnance. And now I say at night, this is mountainous territory. So they're depending on their bombardier navigator who's sitting next to them. The pilot is. The bombardier navigator is, he's in his radar scope. He is mapping the terrain that they're going in. If he's wrong, the mountains don't give, clouds do. So your hands are really, I mean, your life is really in his hands. Now we're standing off a ways away, but we have no doubt where they are because they're taking so much fire. And what people don't realize is Vietnam did not really have electricities once you got outside of the city. And in North Vietnam, of course, they didn't turn it on except for spotlights to try to find us because we were up there 24 hours a day. So when somebody's taking a lot of fire, it's very obvious to you where they are because otherwise you're in a black hole. We took off out of Da Nang and then traveled to Hanoi. It was pitch black all the way, except if somebody was firing at an airplane. And during the day, of course, it wasn't, but there just wasn't, you were just flying up there. There wasn't much going on until you got close.
What was your radar system like during those times to help you when it was pitch dark and figuring out where you were?
Well, I had mentioned that our commanding officer had fought in Korea and also fought with the French. So we had some things that just took place in our squadron. And for instance, when we got to Da Nang, he put reflectors on the end of the runways so that our RIOs, our radar intercept officers, could pick those up in case of a radio failure or the base came under attack and there was nobody in the tower directing us. We could still fly our own ground controlled approach, telling with my Rio, Steve Lear, telling me from the back seat, you know, you're on glide path, or you're a little high, or you're a little low, or come right 1 degree. He could do that. We could do it self-contained. Uh, so that was unique to our squadron. I don't know any other that did it. Marine airplanes were not outfitted with the same gear that Air Force airplanes were. Uh, there's a joke, and that's what it is. But in some instances, it's true too. The Air Force builds a base, the golf course and the Oak Club are built first, then the runway. The Air Force always has the best equipment, the best, you know, they just do. And we didn't have inertial navigation systems, which they could dial in coordinates and the airplane would take them to it. We didn't have that. So what was our radar like? Our radar was an air-to-air radar that we adapted to be able to use some on the ground. It wasn't anything, we had no guided bombs. We had to be in position. Like I said, I used a 90-degree dive, which is straight down. You come in, you roll over on your back and you pull, which is called a split S, until you're going straight down. It's uh, it's easier to hit a target when you're going straight down. Uh, so our radar, once again, was air to air. It wasn't air to ground, although we could map mountains. He could see the mountainous terrain, but he couldn't take me through a gap or something like that with it.
Were you ever on base while the base was attacked? Were there ever situations like that where that came into play?
Yes, we would get uh, sapper attacks, which is somebody getting close to the base and pitching a satchel charge in. But we also got rocketed, and they were 122 rockets, and we got rocketed probably, I don't know, less than 10 times while I was in Da Nang, and I was there from the beginning of August till the end of January, beginning of August of 67 to the end of January of 68. And then I was transferred to Chulai, which is 50 miles south. We probably were rocketed down there less than 10 times as well. However, two of them stand out. One was January 3rd of 1968, and the other one was January 29th of 1968. And I was the maintenance duty officer, meaning I was the only officer down with all the troops. We were getting airplanes out, we were launching them, and we came under a rocket attack. The one on January 3rd blew up five of our airplanes, and I was running through the hangar getting people out, trying to get them in the bunkers, and one came right down in front of me and bounced up into the ass end of a fully loaded F-4, loaded with ordnance and loaded with fuel, which exploded. The hole in the back wall was probably 10 feet by 10 feet where that came through. Luckily, it was a dud. When it landed in front of me, it didn't go off. But when it bounced up in the ass into the F-4, then the whole thing exploded. So that was January 3rd. On January 29th, I was again the maintenance duty officer. I was down on the flight line. And in our old club, we had two cocktail waitresses. Both of them were Vietnamese. One obviously had French blood in her and was a lot prettier than the other one. So you might gather that she got more tips. I hope they split them, but I don't know if they did. But she got more tips than the one that wasn't quite as pretty. And that's I really cleaned that up. So uh, it was January the 3rd, this rocket attack, the first rocket attack, excuse me. Let me back up. And a spooky gunship, which is in our world at that time in 67 was really a DC-3 with Gatling guns that went out the side. And they came in and poured in rounds into where they were launching the 122 rockets. The next day they went up there, and one of the people they killed launching rockets at us was the prettier of the two cocktail waitresses in our old club. So the guys on the ground dealt with us much more than we did, but you never knew who the enemy was. Your friends during the day could turn into the enemy at night, and they were called the Viet Cong. Uh, so I hope I answered that question.
You
Oh,
did.
yeah. And on January 29th, they rocketed us again. They blew up four of our airplanes. Now, when these things go up, they're in revetments. A revetment is a steel housing that goes up probably, I'm guessing, 10 feet, and it's filled with sand. We park our airplanes in between those revetments so that if we are rocketed, the shrapnel can't get to the airplanes. However, they don't protect them from direct hits, and they had four direct hits, which blew up that night. Now, back to our skipper, a commanding officer, being in two wars prior to the Vietnam War. The first thing he did is said, "Go find me a fire truck."
Hmm.
So the troops went out and they fought. They found a completely dilapidated, beat to hell fire truck. They fixed the fire truck up and it was operational. And on January 3rd, on January 29th of 1968, that fire truck saved numerous airplanes.
Wow.
Uh, on January 29th, well, actually, both rocket attacks, there were airplanes blowing up all over the place. Now, I haven't brought this up, but the inter-service cooperation over there was fabulous. The Air Force was on the other side of the Nang base. The Marines were on one side, the Air Force was on the other. The Air Force was closer to the South China Sea. We were closer to the mountains. Uh, and they blew up a bunch of our ground support equipment, meaning equipment we needed to start the airplanes. Uh, Bomb racks that we needed to load the bombs and the ordnance on our airplanes. Our sister squadron was a 389th Tactical Fighter Squadron. It had previously been commanded by Bob Earthquake Titus, a very famous and infamous one-star general later in his career. And then it was commanded by Colonel Oscar Bayer. And the phone rang after we were getting the fires put out, but everything's exploding all around us. And a phone rang, and one of the Marines ran out and said, "You've got a call." I went in and he said, "How are you guys doing?" Now, this was an Air Force squadron commander. I said, I don't know whether we're going to be able to launch. We don't have the right equipment. He said, leave that to me. And once we got all the fires out, sun's coming up, and here comes a Congo line of equipment
Wow.
across the runways from the Air Force, taking care of the Marines. And we launched airplanes by 1 o'clock that day. Now, a funny part of this story is, guys that were always getting hit or shot at, bringing back airplanes with holes in them, we affectionately called them magnet ass. So after that second rocket attacks, I kiddingly say I was transferred to get magnet ass out of here so we could save more airplanes in Da Nang. But I went down to Chulai then after that. And a funny story there in a rocket attack about that is we had a fellow by the name of Dick Pulowski, who had been my bunkmate in OCS, Officer Candidate School, which we call Platoon Leaders Class, which is PLCs. And he'd been my bunkmate. After we left there, I didn't see him again until I got to Chulai, and he later flew in my back seat some. But Pulowski was this gun-ho, absolutely focused Marine, and he came running through, and we started taking rockets. And he went by the officer's quarter and he's screaming, "Get out, get out. They're inside the wires. They're inside the wires." So here's all these guys in their underwear or not, dragging across the sand, on their bellies, going up with a pistol, which we're going to be a hell of a lot of help with that. Anyway, his fire and his inside the wire, being the focused guy that he was, they had hit the PX and they were pop cans blowing up in the fire. Pepsi Cola, Coca Cola, the cans were blowing up. That was what he thought was we were taking fire inside the wire.
How did you,
A funny story.
yeah.
That's a funny story.
What's the end of that story? The
Yeah, the rockets quit. Guys put the fires out, and they repaired the PX, and we were ready to go for the next one.
You were up in the air, but you had to have had and have had and are having and continue to talk with friends that were on the ground. What would they share with you that was most startling and gripping that was so different than your experiences in being up in the skies?
Great question. I'm glad you asked it. Those guys, the Marines were in country for 13 months. The uh, the Air Force that flew down south, they were in country for 13 months, or excuse me, 12 months. The guys that flew to Hanoi and Haiphong, once they got 100 missions north, they went home. The Army troops were in there for 12 months. From the day you got off that airplane, whether you flew your own or you got off that airliner, you would not be dry, clean, or safe for the extent of your tour.
Wow.
You were always soaking wet, sweating. Now, our ground, our Army soldiers and our Marine on the ground, they were constantly wading through rice paddies filled with leeches. They had to fight everything that bit, slithered, or was poison, I think, lived in that country. Uh, that's not to mention the booby traps they were faced with. They would dig pits and put poison punji sticks, which are very sharp sticks, at the bottom of the pit, disguise it, and an annoying Marine or Army soldier be walking along and fall in that pit. Those punji sticks had poison on them, and they came right up through you. There were nooses, traps, snare traps. They could step in and it'd go off and they'd be hanging in a tree. Um, as I said, the average days of combat in World War II were 44. The average days that our grunts, Army troops, and Marine grunts spent in actual combat compared to World War II for 44, were 250. They were in actual combat. That's the average. So you're talking about 17, 18, 19-year-old kids. Uh, they came home to a country they didn't recognize. They were treated so unfairly. They left the hellhole that was Vietnam and came back to their home. Their home had changed a lot while they were gone, and they had changed a lot. And trying to marry the two up is a lifelong struggle. And the media paints us as a bunch of drunks and drug addicts. Not true. The media will tell you that war was fought on the backs of the poor and the blacks. Not true. The black population in Vietnam was exactly the same as the black population in the United States, 12.5%. A majority of the troops came from some type of a middle class home. Uh, Over 70% were volunteers. Another misstatement by the media. Uh, you know, the facts, anybody can Google the facts on the history of the Vietnam War, and it will absolutely slay the person looking at it in comparison to what they've been told by the propagandists, the politicians, and the media.
When you were out there, how aware were you of what was being said by the media, what, say, Lyndon B. Johnson was telling the public or Richard Nixon later on, and in all of the chatter that was happening while you were in conflict in Vietnam?
We were in a complete blackout. I talked to my wife once on the telephone. I saw her on two R&Rs. Uh, Nobody back home is going to write you a letter and give you bad news. And nobody over there is going to write their family a letter and admit what's going on over there. Nobody wants to scare the other one. So we had no idea, none. We got a newspaper that was called the Stars and Stripes, was put out by the armed forces. And of course, there were certain things that were left out of it, uh, probably a lot of things. So we had no idea. When we came home, most of us came from parents that had fought in World War II. So we're thinking ticker tape parade, not to be, quite the opposite. Later in the war, guys were told not to wear their uniforms, to change clothes when they got off the airplane before they went out in public. Uh, it was easier, but not easy for the officers because we were older. You know, I was 25 when I got home. I had a wife and three children, one of whom I'd never seen. So, there was some stability there. For our young troops, our young Marines, they came home to, almost hate. And then when we found what was being said the whole time we were over there, we had no idea. And a best example is Tet of 68, um, which was the worst Tet there was. And I was there. I know what happened. We slaughtered them. And in fact, I'm told, I never saw these, but I'm told they found mass graves. We cut their supply lines off, which were all coming out of Hanoi and Haiphong, which is another story. Uh, but we cut those supply lines off. They were starving. And I'm told that many died of bubonic plague from eating rats. Uh, so fast forward from that to I come home and I see a clip of Walter Cronkite the most trusted man in America, lying to the American people, saying, I've just returned from the front, which there was no front. I've come from Hue and the Tet offensive. And he said, the best that we can hope for is a stalemate, which is an absolute lie, which fed the war machine, the anti-war machine, and completely yanked the rug out from a bunch of kids just doing their duty and defending their country. Now, whether we should have been there or shouldn't have been there, that's another subject altogether. We were there when our president, whoever he is, we've entrusted him with our blood and treasure. And the majority of them in the recent past have subjected that blood and treasure to places and wars we had absolutely no business being in. If you don't intend to win the war, don't get in it. Get in, win it, get out. Our job is to kill the enemy and break things. That's our job and our only job. If you're not going to let us do it and you're going to tie our hands behind our back with rules of engagement, which everybody's heard a lot about, and that's what they do. They tie our hands behind our back. Then don't get in the damn thing. And then after you declare it or after you commit us to it, don't saddle us with these rules of engagement because on second thought, this might cause me some votes. So I've got to soften the blow. Not worried about the blood and treasure they're committing to this fight.
When you would hear afterwards, when you came home, how Lyndon B. Johnson was, and maybe this is the wrong word, but spinning the way things were over there and what was happening, what wasn't happening. How did that make you feel knowing you were there and you noted that there were discrepancies in what you witnessed firsthand, your accounts, and what the President of the United States was telling millions and millions of people?
Lyndon B. Johnson never spun. Lyndon B. Johnson flat ass lied. He lied all the time. We had bombing shortages over there. He told the American public we didn't. I flew missions with one bomb. I could carry 12. And we were also told by Westmoreland, General Westmoreland, uh, we were told to jettison our ordnance in the ocean because they were famous for claiming tonnage of bombs dropped. They were telling us to jettison working bombs in the ocean so they could up their tonnage. He also said we were not in Laos. I was in Laos weekly the whole time I was there. Uh, so Lyndon B. Johnson was a liar and he committed blood and treasure to something he knew nothing about. Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert Strange, wonderful middle name, McNamara, uh, they selected targets. They told people what run-in headings they wanted and what time they wanted them to go. What the hell do these two buffoons know about anything? They don't know of anything. Lyndon Johnson was given a Silver Star in World War II for riding on an airplane that supposedly came under attack that everybody disputes. And if you ever look at Lyndon Johnson, he's got a little pin up here in his lapel with a Silver Star. He didn't earn a Silver Star, just more of the lie.
You brought up General Westmoreland. How do you feel like his legacy is depicted on, say, what it was in the middle of the conflict and how people would view him now?
Well, I'm not exactly certain how long he was there, but I think he was there for 7 years. Uh, a tour of duty, as we've expressed before, is 12 or 13 months. So my suspicion, uh, actually, what I believe is he was there because he was a yes man. He was the senior military advisor there. He was in charge of our military in Vietnam. Why in the hell didn't we mine Haiphong Harbor? Why didn't he stand up to Johnson and McNamara and say, all the supplies are coming from Russia into Haiphong Harbor? Why didn't we mine it? Why were we not allowed to bomb Russian ships when they were in there offloading supplies? Why were fighters carrying, like I could carry 12 bombs? A B-2 could carry 110. Why did they wait till 1972 when President Nixon had the guts to turn Hanoi and Haiphong into a moonscape, and that brought the end of the war? Why did it take so long? Why do we need 560,000 troops? And why are there over 53,000 on a wall in Washington, D.C.? And why do we have so many people to this day are maimed? Their lives were essentially destroyed. Why? Because of the leadership in Washington. And I would say if General Westmoreland was such a great leader, then why the hell didn't he stand up to Johnson and fight for his troops? That's what we're always taught to do. You're fighting for your own troops. So I don't think much of Westmoreland. Oh, and then he sued CBS.
Yeah.
And he sued CBS, and all of us donated money. Where the hell did the money go? He capitulated. So he got us again.
The difference in how you, as a combat veteran in Vietnam War, evaluate LBJ, how is that in comparison to how you view, and you alluded to it a little bit about the differences strategically from Richard Nixon, but you're in the room with both of them. What are you saying to one about what they did, and what are you saying to the other about how they handled things?
Well, don't let me forget to tell you about Nixon. Uh, Robin Olds uh, was the commanding officer of the 8th TAC Fighter Wing in Ubon, Thailand. Robin Olds brought in totally different tactics. When he got to Ubon, uh, I'll go back to World War II. Robin Olds had 14 kills in World War II. He was a squadron commander at 22 years old. He was an All-American football player at West Point. He was the epitome of a leader. When he got to Ubon, he sent all the deadwood home. He then installed new squadron commanders. Uh, Nobody went to the bar when he got there. Everybody's dauber was down. They were losing so many guys. He upped the morale, and they led during his time uh, the other services in amount of aerial victories. When he came home, I mean, he was on the front page of all newspapers throughout darn near his tenure. He was a commanding officer when they had Operation Bolo, something that was planned by J.B. Stone, who was a senior captain. Another fella, and his name slips my mind right now. But they disguised themselves as thuds, F-105 bombers coming in. And they always sent the MiGs up after the bombers. They didn't send them up after the fighters. and they broke through the clouds and started screaming, fighters, fighters. And they had 7 kills that day. That was Robin and his staff's planning. J.B. Stone got a MiG that day as well. Robin got two. Uh, so when he came home, he was a person Johnson wanted to talk to. So he got in his office, and Johnson's question was, what the hell do I do about Vietnam? Robin's answer was very short. Win the damn thing. We're back to don't get in a war unless you plan on winning it. So that was Robin. That was Johnson. Johnson was absolutely clueless. And all he really cared about was how am I gonna run again and get reelected in 68? Robin went home in October of 67. So Johnson was still planning to run. So once again, you got a damn politician worried about votes instead about the blood and treasure of the United States of America. President Nixon, I don't know much about what he did other than he authorized the mining of Haiphong Harbor, which was way overdue. He authorized the B-52s in there, which was way overdue. He ended the war. He brought our POWs home. Uh, we're all forever grateful for what President Nixon did. Now, what he had been doing prior to making those decisions, I'm not privy to. But as far as I'm concerned, the media and the left did to President Nixon what they tried to do to President Trump.
I see where you're coming from. And you you watch how it all ended in 75 and people are moving back. I know you weren't perhaps there in 75 because you had gone and done your tour, but what are you experiencing when you see, people going into that US embassy and trying to jump on helicopters to get out of there in time and and parsing together what you witnessed from photos or videos?
President Nixon, when he withdrew our troops, we won the war. Henry Kissinger gave it away at the negotiating table, in my view,
Yeah.
and that's just my view. Uh, President Nixon promised the South Vietnamese, who had fought alongside of us, and yes, I'm very aware that many were Viet Cong fighting on the side of North Vietnam. But President Nixon promised the South Vietnamese people who had suffered through this whole war, suffered and suffered and suffered beyond belief. He promised them we would support them. After we pulled out, Congress yanked the rug out from under him and cut the funding. One of the leaders of cutting that funding was a man named Joe Biden. We left them with nothing. We abandoned them. North Vietnamese came in and slaughtered them, sent them to concentration camps called re-education camps, and killed hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese, our allies, because our politicians, who very few had fought in that war, made the decision to yank the funding to give away and prop up their social programs to buy votes. So we sold out our allies to buy votes. And Joe Biden was one of the prime movers on that.
Well, another prime mover in being very influential about his position and having a humongous mouthpiece and platform to share his experiences is Oliver Stone. He will talk about the war, and he'll have his own experiences having fought in the war. He made a movie, and Platoon was its name, where he said that he tried to get it as close to what he experienced in terms of there were certain characters that he portrayed in the movie that were like that which were guys around him when he was out there in his tour. When you consider that movie makers have had Platoon and Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket, and there's Deer Hunter, and there's other movies like that. Where are they missing the mark with what you know from what you saw and what Hollywood is doing to these movies? Even though you have somebody like Oliver Stone who served and was there, but had his story to share as well.
The only Vietnam movie that I ever really watched, and it's also my favorite, although I disagree with some of the dialogue, was Good Morning Vietnam. It was produced by David Steinberg, who was Rob, can't think of his
There's a
the
Rob Steinberg.
no uh, Robin Williams is who I'm
Robin
trying.
Williams, yeah.
He was Robin Williams and Billy Crystal's manager, and he was over at our house one day because his father-in-law was a dear friend of mine, Paul Thayer, who was a Navy ace in World War II, later the CEO of Ling Temco Vought, and had been a test pilot for Chance Vought. Well, LTV, Ling Temco Vought, owned Steamboat at one time when Paul Thayer was the CEO of LTV. And so he was up here, and we had a little party from all of us that had known him when he was in Steamboat. And his son-in-law was here and came over to the house, and he saw a picture on my wall. He said, "Did you fly those?" Meaning the F-4. I said, "Yeah." And he told me that he wrote and produced Good Morning Vietnam. I said, "The only Vietnam movie I've ever liked." I don't know what drove Oliver Stone to come up with what he did. And I was only there in 67, 68. And I know there were a lot of things that happened after I left. I never saw. Uh, but Hollywood, Hollywood's Hollywood. What can I say? Uh, when I was just a child, Hollywood made great movies. In fact, it inspired me to want to be a fighter pilot.
Wow.
You always had the June Allison movies with various different characters, actors, and they were great. They were patriotic. Uh, One movie that comes to mind, and I've used this in speeches, is Bridges of Tokori. And in one of the closing scenes of that, there was a forerunner of our Jolly Greens, who I mentioned are unsung heroes from that Vietnam War, the things they flew through to pick us up on the ground, the things they did to save a pilot were just legendary. But a forerunner to them was it was a helicopter pilot and a character played by Mickey Rooney. And in the closing scene, Mickey Rooney gets shot down, and the star of the movie is also shot down, and they're all killed. Uh, and the admiral is on the bridge, And he looks off into the horizon and he said, "Where do we find such men?" And and all of a sudden a horn went off and the words came, "Launch airplanes." Because in a war, nothing stops. You just have to go on, carry on, and do your job. And then years later, I'm not sure of the year, President Reagan invited all the river rats, the members of Red River Valley Fighter Pilot Association, and all the POWs to the White House. And we were seated on the South Lawn. And in his speech, he started out with that quote. And he was talking about the POWs when they came home. And he said, when I was governor of California, Nancy and I hosted some of the POWs, and we heard such stories. And we were just enthralled. And after they left that night, I asked Nancy, "Where do we find such men?" And he said, the answer came to me just as quick as I asked the question. We find them where we've always found them, in the stores, in the streets, in the towns and the cities of America. It's just the greatest functioning idea ever in history. So we answered the Admiral, and he answered many questions. And Ronald Reagan was a hero to me.
There were heroic actions taken by the nurses. I know that what you went through and what your buddies went through was a tremendous ordeal. But what do you think it was like being a nurse on the ground and what they were exposed to, and how did they get through it, Jack? How did they do it?
Well, I think we've just stumbled across a question which brings back the term hero, in this case, heroine. Uh, People don't realize this, but the Navy and the Air Force, when a nurse graduated from nursing school, she was kept in the States for 2 years before she was sent over. The Army nurses were given a quick briefing on how to salute and how to put on a uniform, and they were gone. So 2 or 3 weeks out of nursing school, these heroines were subjected to some of the worst conditions. Watching these kids come in shot to pieces. I mean, their first day, you hear a helicopter come in, and there are people running around the medical departments yelling, "Incoming, incoming," and they run out not knowing what they're going to get off of there. It could be the girl's first day, and she comes in and here's a person shot to pieces. Uh, they, I just wish more credit was given to them. I wish more people would recognize what they went through. And when we were in Chulai, we had a hospital there, and we got to know some of the nurses, and we heard just incredible stories. Usually, by the time they got to their officers' club, they didn't want to talk about it, but at times they did, and we heard unbelievable stories. And there's a book that came out entitled "The Women," written by Kristen Hanna. And I encourage everybody to read that book, and you'll find out where some of the heroes really were.
Legendary, their work. You brought this up a little bit ago, how legendary these helicopter pilots were in rescuing these men from from dire situations. How much admiration do you have for those men who would swoop in and save lives and do it under hellacious circumstances?
Let me tell you this, they never buy a drink in a fighter pilot bar. Uh, all of our helicopter pilots were courageous, unbelievably courageous. I knew, of course, many, many helicopter pilots, Marine helicopter pilots, one of whom was a high school classmate uh, and was killed. Uh, the Army chopper drivers, just the same. They go into conditions that were unbelievable. Hot landing zones, meaning it's taking fire, it's taking rockets. But they'd come in, they'd medevac troops, they'd hang it out so far you wouldn't believe it. Uh, Everybody that flew a helicopter in Vietnam uh, falls in that hero class. And the Jolly Greens are paramount to fighter pilots, but the guys that flew in South Vietnam are paramount to the troops on the ground and the pilots down there. And also our SAR choppers off our carriers, our Navy helicopter pilots. Guys went down, they went in under fire to pull them out. If they got to the water, the SAR choppers took over from the carriers. It wasn't the Jolly Greens coming from Thailand. So, you mentioned heroes, and you brought up something very near and dear to every fighter pilot's heart, are helicopter pilots, and there again, another class of heroes. The Army had a program. It was unbelievable. It was a warrant officer program. And they took kids right out of high school, trained them in a helicopter. They didn't have instrument tickets, sent them to Vietnam. These guys were absolutely fearless. They acted like just what they were. High school kids with hot rods. They would go into anything. They didn't have instrument tickets, so they'd come in under 150-foot ceilings to go into a hot landing zone to drop off troops, pick up troops, take our wounded out, and take them back to the nurses we just spoke about. Uh, just hand salute to every one of them.
What would it take for you to go back to Vietnam or to entertain the thought of visiting?
My wife and I were scheduled to go over there with a Marine fighter pilot who is doing tours over there. And we're going to go with a whole bunch of friends. And for one reason or another, the friends kept dropping out, and it ended up just him. And although I would love to have gone with Jim Toohey back to Vietnam because we were there together, he was a Marine F-8 pilot. Uh, I didn't want to go with a bunch of strangers that I didn't know. And so we didn't go. It's not something uh, that I have such bad memories I don't want to go back to. In fact, two of our three daughters just went over there, and they spent I think they spent a week over there with a group. Might have been 10 days. But sending back pictures and stuff, went to places I was. Of course, they changed, but uh, my wife's a flight attendant or was a flight attendant for Delta Airlines, and I was a pilot for Delta Airlines. And for 5 years, we flew trips from Taipei, Taiwan, to Bangkok, Thailand, and we would go right over Da Nang. And we retired in '01 and '02. But when we went over those in the 90s, the hangars that we used were still there with the very faded decals of the squadrons who were housed there. And we could see it from the air from 35,000 feet. It was inhabited by MiGs, but I wish it had been when we were there. Uh, so I have no heartache about going back, except I had malaria and I try to stay the hell away from heat and humidity. So that would be my only thought about negative thought about going back. And as far as meeting some of the people we fought against, a lot of guys who shot down MiGs or who were shot down by MiGs have met the guys that did it in gatherings in later years. And I have no heartache with any of them. They were doing the same thing I was. They're fighting for their homeland.
What has it taken for you to come to that level of understanding and acceptance, knowing that your life was on the line just as it was for the other side? And to how hard and what has it taken for you to even just contemplate the thought of putting that behind you and opening up the dialogue and sort of not forgetting, but not letting that get in the way of opening up new doors of conversation with with once people who were adversaries.
Well, I learned from Robin Olds and his experience in World War II. He met guys he shot down, and he told me about his past. And we were very close friends the last 30 years of his life, Robin, my wife, and I. And I mentioned he was such a tremendous leader. Uh, what I didn't mention is all the things he shared that, were life lessons. I don't think I had, once I left there, I don't think I had any animosity for them. I think once I got home, I had more animosity for our politicians who were letting the blood and treasure they sent over there get shot to hell for no reason. We could have won that war in 2 weeks. That's all. It could have been over. I don't know about these following on wars, what we could do with them, especially Afghanistan. I have no idea how you would ever win there. The Russians got caught in a quagmire there for 20 years. Then we got caught in a quagmire for 20 years. And then we had, say this nicely, a below average inhabitant of the White House. And our departure from there was despicable. Uh, so once again, we're back to those leaders, and we're back to the blood and treasure they sent to fight those wars. And I'll tell you another one. We have a bunch of hawks who are pro-war in our Congress and in our Senate. Sometimes we have one in the White House. Dick Cheney is one of the biggest. Uh, Dick Cheney is my age. Funny, I never saw him over there. He wasn't there.
Yeah.
Our politicians are very good at putting our kids in harm's way, not so good at going themselves, or in many cases, putting their children in harm's way. The reason? Because there's so damn much money. Washington, D.C. is a sewer. There is so much money. The military industrial complex are completely supported by wars. A lot of equipment gets lost. We lost 400 F-105s in Vietnam, 525 Phantoms, 350 or so A4s. Takes a lot of money to replace all those airplanes, not to mention the Jeeps, the personnel carriers, the M16, which was another joke given to our troops to defend themselves, uh, taking the M14 away from them. And for months, the M16 was known to jam. Well, there you are, an 17, 18, 19-year-old kid. Your lifeline's that weapon. It jams. Where are you? Who the hell bought these things? And who the hell put them into operation? They knew there were problems. there were all kinds of people selling military equipment during the Vietnam War that was substandard, and it happened in our squadron. And we lost two airplanes and almost lost a third because we were sold tires that had been sitting out in the sun and were rotten. And on takeoff, you couldn't see anything. On takeoff, mine blew up, leaving Wake Island. Luckily, there wasn't anything around, and I was able to get the airplane back on the runway after careening through the mud and stuff. Funny part of that, a funny thing I remember is we were going too slow. You had to be going 100 knots to eject safely on the ground. The 00 seat where you could eject safely came in much later. But we had to be going 100 knots, and I was going 120 when my left wheel blew up, and I did a 90-degree turn because the wheel froze. It was on fire, and it yanked me that way, and I was going through mud, losing airspeed. And so I told my backseater, Steve Lear, I said, "Hang on it, we might be going in the water." And in his comedic retort was, "I'm right behind you, man." Being from Louisiana, man was pronounced Maine. We tore out a bunch of runway lights and got the airplane under control at the other end of the runway. The next day, our executive officer, the number two officer in our squadron, his wheel blew up, and he went into a Pan Am terminal in in the Philippines, and they had just backed a 707 out that was full of guys going on R&R when he went into it. I lost that airplane, and then our skipper was taken off out of Da Nang with guns and 750-pound bombs, and his left wheel blew up, and he hit the stanchion that reels the arresting gear. Like you have in a carrier, you have the arresting gear, the cables that go across the deck. There's four of them. Well, we also had one going across our runways. So if we came in shot up and didn't have brakes due to lack of hydraulic fluid, we just put the hook down and that would stop us. Well, there's stanchions. Like on a carrier, there are stanchions that roll those cables up and also that let the tension out and allow them to be put over in the right positions, then tighten them in preparation for a landing. Well, on the runway, there's the same thing. And these stanchions are great big things. And our skipper went into one of them and lost that airplane. He and his backseater were fine, but 750-pound bombs were blowing up, and they dove in a ditch after they got out of the airplane. And he went back to get help his backseater out of the airplane.
So your buddy, your backseater, Steve, how much were you guys in conversation once your tour wrapped up?
Oh, we stayed in touch all these years. Steve lives in central Michigan now. For years, he lived in Portland, Oregon. He was a high school girls basketball coach,
Oh.
as well as he worked for numerous meat distributors, selling meat and sold meat to Costco, along with being a girls basketball coach. He was quite successful at it. He's retired and he substitute teach in Michigan, and uh, he's very good at being anti everything the last administration was for, and gets by with it because of his sense of humor. It was his principle, and tells his students how the cow how things are, you know, how things have been. He instills pride in America, which was sorely lacking for a number of years. I think President Trump did it his first term. I think he's certainly doing it now. Uh, and it's just like President Reagan coming out of the Carter years. He instilled pride in America once again. Uh, you know, that's so important. We live in the greatest, freest country the world has ever known. And why? We have people trying to tear us down and destroy us and create conflict. I understand part of the why. Politicians create conflict to get themselves elected. But why are we electing them? That's my question. If they're sowing seeds of conflict now, we give them a bully pulpit, they're just going to sow more. And what we've gone through in the last couple of decades harkens back to Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. Probably his most prominent one is create chaos everywhere, which you've certainly seen. Create chaos everywhere. They'll be so busy putting out the fires of chaos that we'll be allowed to govern as we want. And that's exactly what Americans trying to destroy America do. I don't remember any discussion of racism. I am absolutely colorblind. I served with the finest of Black Marines. I say Black, I don't say colored because I've been corrected by my friends who are Black. They say colored. What the hell color are we? So I mean absolutely no disrespect when I say that. One of the finest generals I've ever known was the first Black general in the Marine Corps.
Well, let me ask you this, Jack. The perception of the Vietnam War veteran, what has that evolution process been like from the US government standpoint? And how, since you wrapped up your tour of duty, how your perception or reception in their eyes has been changed, or how has that changed over the years?
Um, I, in a way, I think they've tried to heal that wound. I'm not speaking for myself. I'm speaking for all of those guys who came back completely disillusioned. I'm speaking for those who are maimed. I'm speaking for the families of those who are on the wall. I was very fortunate. I came home. A lot of guys didn't. And our Gold Star families and our caregivers and our troops who were maimed, uh, you know, in the past, they weren't treated well by the VA because we didn't have somebody in the White House holding the VA's feet to the fire. It's very difficult to fire a government employee. Um, that changed under President Reagan. It changed again under President Trump. President Trump promised that he would put an 800 number in the White House. It would be manned by veterans. If you had a complaint or you weren't getting proper treatment, and there's a lot of great people in the VA, please don't take me wrong, a lot of great dedicated people. However, there are some weak links in the VA, and they spend money like it's their own nickel when we've got people who need care, meaning they're disabled for life. They need a percentage of disability that don't get it. Uh, President Trump put the 800 number in for us to call. Congress defunded it after 3 months. So we were back to square one. But he kept the heat on. As soon as he left, everything went to hell in a handbasket again. Now that he's back in, we have a different VA. So how I, I I'm so fortunate. I am so very fortunate. Uh, I have no. I look back and I'm so happy I got that experience. I have lifelong friends, close friends who I met over there, who I've met in the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. Uh, I I almost I hate to say this way, but I think I was given so much because of that war. But there are a lot of families who weren't. There's a lot of caregivers who weren't. There's a lot of people who were, their lives were ruined by that war. I don't know how they've come to grips with it. I just consider myself very fortunate.
My last question for you, and I just feel fortunate to have you share your story with such depth and such realness and authenticity that I go to what you think the public now can learn about the whole Vietnam War experience. And I don't just say the public, but I also say those people who are putting our armed forces in harm's way, those who make decisions about what wars we fight or what wars we don't fight, those who hold political offices. How can they learn, or what can they learn in terms of that war overall, but also international relations with different countries? And I want to say that so that it never happens again, but you know, you were talking about the military industrial complex. Even with that said, you mentioned what you took from the war. What can those who didn't serve, what can they take from the war that will forever change them, be it somebody in politics or be it the common man who wants to know what you went through?
I almost think there needs to be an indoctrination course when these people get elected for the first time. Uh, I think they need to be made aware of. They take a very similar oath of office that we do. Uh, and in that oath, it discusses foreign and domestic. It discusses that for a reason. Read domestic politicians. So know who you vote for. Don't vote for a party. I, I'm a registered Republican, you might be able to tell. I don't give a damn about the Republican Party. I care about America. Show me the best man. That's who I'm going to vote for. And I consider President Truman, who was a Democrat, I consider him one of the top three presidents of my lifetime because he had the guts to drop the bomb and save millions of lives. Yes, he took lives, but he saved millions of lives. Much the same as President Trump has just done. He's taken a nuclear option away from a bunch of terrorists, religious fanatics, and he's taken it away. And in doing so, the rest of the world went, whoa, we now have a man who will do what has to be done to make America great again and to keep America strong always. So, what has to be done, we have to educate the public of who these people are that they're electing to office. I remember when John Kerry ran for president. He was a swift boat driver in South Vietnam. The swift boat guys hated him. So between the swift boat guys and the River Rats, uh, we raised a ton of money for John Kerry in one night, just on the telephone. I mean, for Kerry's opponent in one night, just on the telephone to defeat John Kerry, because we knew who he was. By the way, the medals you always hear of him throwing over the fence, his medals when he got back from Vietnam, they weren't his. Just more symbolism, excuse me, but more bullshit instead of fact. Uh, so I think that a politician has to be educated once he gets there, but that sewer's so polluted, the money flows, and that directs so many decisions. I can't think of his name right now, but there's a senator from Connecticut who, when he first ran for office, he was a Marine Reserve. First ran for office, had a story he told about his Vietnam War experience and how he held bleeding Marines. He was never in Vietnam. And the people of Connecticut continue to send that fraud back to Washington, D.C. That's where the rot in America is. Crooked politicians.
Well, you certainly come from a place that has seen the the mistrust from and the disconnect from those in politics and those like yourself who had to do what they said, and then to see what they said about what you were doing, to lie about it, but to have you who was there, this firsthand account. Years have gone by and more people will have their own opinions about things, but why I felt it so important to have you is because people with opinions, that doesn't necessarily mean they were there. And preserving what happened, the historians like yourself that went through the tough fights and know what it's like, those are stories that need to be echoed around the world for time, space, and continuum. And so, as we conclude here, Jack, I am forever indebted to your openness to go places, to talk about some of the more challenging, but you said it, challenges can turn into something that's uplifting for you, and you have found some goodness in the pain in what you went through. I'm humbled to share this time with you to get a real deep look into what you went through, how you've processed it all, and how much to this day those men and women who you served with, how much they mean to you. And thank you so
Well, I speak for myself, Brian, but I also speak for every guy that I know who flew over there, and we were honored to do it.